Committee of the European Parliament. As you'll know, Parliament has been following the Mediterranean, the situation to the south of the Mediterranean closely, and the deterioration in Libya has been an important concern for us all. After the last meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council on the 17th of November, it said that it would present options and actions for the European Union, and it also expressed support for your efforts to encourage national dialogue in a very complicated situation, especially after the Libyan Constitutional Court's judgment on the election. On the 26th of November, the chairman's microphone has unfortunately gone off, and they stressed that there cannot be a single military solution to the present situation. In order to allow time for the debate, I'm going to give you the floor first for a short introduction, 10 minutes or so, on the present situation in Libya. We should like to hear from you in particular what the European Union can offer to find a political way out of the situation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to come back to the European Parliament. After 3 years in the European Union's family, I was really missing Brussels. That might surprise some of you, that it's possible to miss Brussels, particularly those of you who, like me, come from somewhere with rather more sun. But that's the fact. I did miss Brussels, the life in Brussels, the institutions, and I'm happy to be back here again and to be able to exchange views with you all. Now, as you know, the situation in Libya is a complicated one. It's particularly attracted concern over the last 4 or 5 months, since in July there started to be confrontations around Tripoli, where Islamic militias were calling on the Sintan militias to get out of the Tripoli airport. And there was a political narrative covering this about exclusion of certain forces and an attempt by forces close to the former Gaddafi regime to resume control of political institutions in Libya and to derail the transition. We went through 2 months of confrontation in Tripoli, followed by a degree of calm, and then after that confrontations resumed both around Benghazi and in certain places west of Tripoli in the Nafusa Mountains. And that is the situation where we are at the moment in military terms, in terms of confrontation on the ground. The international community, the United Nations, the European Union, have reacted to these confrontations and this situation of instability because it greatly concerns the whole international community because of the enormous repercussions in so many senses for Europe as well as for Libya's neighbours. The consequences of instability in Libya, first of all, have to do with security, but also have consequences. There are also consequences for terrorism, for migratory flows, for energy. Libya is at the heart of the Mediterranean, in the centre of our south. So anything that happens to Libya affects the whole region and affects Europe. And it gives rise to very great concern in the whole international community. Our reaction right from the start was to try to recover the political process, to try to recover what might be called the transition although all political terms in Libya end up meaning something different from what they would mean in other countries in the region. In Tunisia, you can talk about a transition towards democracy, but in Libya, we talk about transition from a non-state situation, from a dictatorship, which didn't just destroy the institutions, it didn't just destroy any sort of political construction. It also destroyed the mentality, destroyed the political culture, if I can call that, of Libyans. And the destructive effects of that regime are still being suffered today, and they have a lot to do with the crisis that we are going through. So, to get back to the transition, to get back to the political process, that's what the international community has been trying to achieve. In the first stage, we were working with the members of the Chamber of Representatives, which is the only internationally recognized democracy. That's what's called the Gadmes I process. And the members of Parliament were involved in that process, who had attended Parliament sessions from the start, and who essentially came from the areas of Misrata, Tripoli, and the west of Libya. Where a boycott of Parliament was going on. But then that process was interrupted at the beginning of November, when a decision was handed down by the Libyan Supreme Court in an extremely ambiguous judgment, which certainly didn't set down a clear institutional map for the country, but which was taken by political forces and the former National Congress in Tripoli as a confirmation that the Chamber of Representatives isn't any longer representative, and that the legislative power had to reside with the National Congress in Tripoli. That is why the whole political process has now become more complicated. Whichever way you care to read the Supreme Court's judgment, and it's extremely difficult to read it, but however you read it, as I say, however you interpret it, it's clear that on the ground there has been a change. Firstly, because neither of the two parliaments now contains an opposition. If one of the principles we always worked with Libya on was that legitimacy comes when you have an opposition, and that if neither parliament has an opposition, then neither is fully legitimate. Secondly, the position of the various actors has changed, and their self-perception of their role as politicians in the National Congress is now much stronger than it used to be. And that, too, requires us to change the way we're working on the ground. And thirdly, some of the players in this Gadames I dialogue, in this case the members of Parliament who were boycotting the sessions of the Parliament in Tobruk, have now accepted the court's judgment. So although the international community may not want or be able to take the text on board because it's so ambiguous, we have had to change our focus of the whole approach, and that's what's happened over the last 3 weeks. We think at the moment we are very close to being able to make an announcement of a return to the political process. We hope that may happen very soon, maybe even in a few days' time. And then we may be able next week to go back to Gadames or to whatever Libyan city the parties agree on in order to resume the political process. As I said, there's an agreement of principle on all sides. We still have to do a little detailed work to confirm that. Tomorrow there's going to be an important meeting here in Brussels at ministerial level. Which will allow us to collect international support for a few of the more influential protagonists of this process of return to the political process. And as to the question with which we started this meeting, what can the European Union do? What I have to tell you is that in the United Nations view, the European Union can do a great deal. It can do a great deal at political level because it is an essential partner for Libya. Unlike other neighbours, the European Union is a partner who is seen as neutral, with a great deal of influence and a great deal of penetration in Tobruk and Misrata and Tripoli. So it's a fundamental player. Both the European Union and the envoys of the various envoys of the member states were working on the ground and collaborating, of course, with the European Union and United Nations in a very active and constructive way, playing their part in all the peace processes. Economically, the Union is also Libya's main partner, essential partner. Most trade in all directions and in all fields, although essentially, as you know, it's about energy products. But in all fields, the European Union is the fundamental economic partner for Libya. And the responsibility, and I would say the need, to explain to Libyan interlocutors that it is only a political agreement and only a situation that is accepted and acceptable to all, that it's only that way that the economic flows will continue. But for as long as there is complete confusion about who to talk to, about who is in charge of what, and about what's happening with the central bank and the Libyan Investment Authority, and what's going on with the militias who want to take control of oil installations, what's happening with the multinationals, what's happening with the big telecommunications companies. I mean, we have an international situation here where a lot of European countries recognize one parliament and one government, but the actual internal legal structure in Libya recognizes a different parliament and government, and that has consequences for companies. So I stress that there's a practical need as well as a responsibility for Europe to explain to its Libyan interlocutors that they have to resolve this situation, that they have to reach a political agreement in order, among other things, to achieve a healthy economic relationship with the rest of the world, particularly Europe, which is its main trading partner. Europe has a lot that it could say about the security situation, because it was European countries who took the lead in the revolution against Gaddafi. Both the parties in conflict at the moment see Europe as a fundamental partner in the revolution that they shared, and as a fundamental partner in the building of a new Libya, which also includes security aspects. And lastly, and very much tied to the security and terrorism question, the European Union is also suffering the threat of terrorist groups And you'll know that in eastern cities like Darna or Benghazi, that threat is important, but it isn't only in the east, they're also there in the south. And the European Union is active in the whole of the Sahel region. We share with the countries in the region very great concern. And there are perennial flows. There's also been talk of even jihadist training camps in the south of Libya, and even in the west, to a lesser extent. But in areas like Srebrata, there has been talk of jihadist elements operating possibly in Tunisia. So that there has to be concern here, not just about Libya, but also with a view to the whole region and to a country like Tunisia, but also, of course, Algeria, whose stability and security is a concern of ours. So the Union is a fundamental partner in security, in politics, in economics. It's deeply involved in the whole political process. It's a fundamental partner for the United Nations. And the fact that a European is leading the United Nations mission, who was previously active representing the European Union in the countries to the south, that is precisely because the UN recognizes the role of the European Union. It's no question of personal merit. I think it's simply a recognition of what the European Union has been doing in recent years, a recognition of its role as a neutral facilitator, looking for stability and political progress for the countries to the south of the Mediterranean. And in the case of Libya, I'm sure that is what is going on. So this is a process opening up which may be the last chance for Libya. If the Libyans are not able to take the opportunity that is open to them at the moment over the next few days with this new Gadames II process, then they may find that they have missed the opportunity of a political solution, and they may be heading for more confrontation and more insecurity, and we may have to reduce the options available to them and give a more leading role to the people who are now encouraging confrontation and encouraging a military military exit from the complicated political situation in which Libya stands. This is the right time for the international community to send a very strong message, and I think your committee can do that as well. A message to all parties in Libya that they must spare no effort to find a political solution. They need to understand that we can see no other solution. They need to look beyond their individual interests towards the political interest of Libya and of the international community. Those are the fundamental elements, Mr. Chairman, but I'm sure that in the course of our dialogue we'll be able to go into these ideas in greater depth, and we'll be able to find other fields of action that I'm sure will be relevant for the European Union. Thank you, Mr. Leon. We've got quite a lot of time, so I think we can now offer each speaker 2 minutes. Mr. Miljan Mon is the first speaker. Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Leon, for coming here to the Parliament again, and you're welcome once more. And let me wish you luck in your extremely difficult task. We know that internal dialogue is very difficult, and the Constitutional Court's recent judgment has made it even more difficult, if possible. Let me ask you first, apart from the difficult internal dialogue, it isn't always all that easy to have international consultation, particularly with the regional countries of the region and the neighbouring countries. You're saying that that's essential. Are we trying to get these positions of the neighbouring countries to agree or to come closer to each other? Because they haven't always agreed, have they? The European Union, on its 17th September statement, was trying to encourage precisely that process, but I'd like you to talk a bit more about how much convergence there is there. Secondly, can you tell us a bit more about this ministerial conference tomorrow? And lastly, Resolution 2174 from August, the Security Council, of course. What results has that produced in the 4 months since it was passed on arms, on security? What first results can be detected in the 4 months that that resolution has been in force? Thank you very much. There are now more speakers, so everyone is down to a minute and a half. Mr. Panzeri is next.
Ben ritrovato, Bernardino.
Nice to see you again, Bernadino. Well, I think the Libyans should take this last opportunity, and the Europeans as well need fully to understand the disaster that they perpetrated in Libya, because if the Europeans don't even understand it, then the Libyans won't see that it's the last chance. And that's why I think we need to go beyond the wishes expressed. Yesterday, the High Representative who spoke in this room said, on the subject of possible initiatives by certain EU countries, that she wasn't against the initiatives as long as there's a close relationship with the European Commission, and it should all be part of a single design. I think that's the right attitude, because it's true that we've made a lot of mistakes, and some countries went it alone, as it were, earlier on. And if we don't appreciate those mistakes, it'll be difficult to see how we move on from here, because we intervened in Libya and then we just left them to their own devices. We didn't worry about what happened afterwards, and now we're talking about geopolitically, about the energy, the question of migration, and the Caliphate and ISIS and terrorism, which you explained so well. But what should we be doing? What initiatives should we be taking? Well, the parties have shown a willingness to meet, but where will this be going? I have to say that looking at the situation in Libya, I mean, I obviously hope that everything will go well, but I've got so many doubts about how it's going to go. So do we have a plan B? That's my question, because if there is no agreement found, then we need to understand whether the international community, starting with the UN, are going to talk to somebody, and who are they going to talk to, because they have to decide.
Señor Tannock.
Dr. Tannock.
Over here, Mr. Bernardino Leon, I have to say Libya has been a bit of a disaster. I mean, NATO went in with the best of intentions to get rid of the Gaddafi horrendous dictatorship, but seems to have walked away prematurely. Algeria was probably right in warning us now of a possible danger of partition of that country. And I have a series of questions. First of all, can you confirm the embarrassing allegation that some of the member states, including my own, with the best intention again, actually trained militarily some of the militiamen, thinking that would actually add to the security? Many of these have returned to Libya and become Islamist jihadists instead, which has been an absolute, fiasco. Two, the role of Qatar in funding the Islamists, the Misrata groups in particular, Ansar al-Sharia. Can you confirm any knowledge of that? What is the state of progress of General Khalifa Haftar in prosecuting his war against Ansar al-Sharia? We haven't heard much about that recently. And lastly, you mentioned the Supreme Court judgment in Tripoli. Certainly my Libyan contacts say that the Supreme Court judges have been intimidated, and therefore their judgment cannot be seen to be objective or impartial, and therefore we shouldn't feel in any way bound by the decision of non-recognition of the Tobruk Parliament.
Gracias, señor Tannock. Señor Nar.
Thank you, Mr. Nar. We're talking about Libya, which strikes me as phantasmagorical, a Libya of appearances, the so-called Libyan National Congress, or General National Congress, which sits in Tripoli and is as unrepresentative as the Chamber of Representatives, which apparently collected an 18% turnout. But of course you have to have a structure to find somebody to talk to, a counterparty. But if this apparent interlocutor doesn't have the real interlocutor, the real power, the effective power of arms, of the militias behind it, then you have metaphysical agreements that you can strike without agreements on the ground, because on the ground there are clans, families, tribes and militias whose effect is to control the wealth, because that's what they live on. This is not just the north, because there's also the south. I don't agree that you're not where you are from personal merit. You're there fundamentally for your personal merit, which I recognize in public, and I'm glad to, if you deserve it. What I'm really worried about is Gerdemez too, if it doesn't closely involve the clan and tribe groups, the sheikhs, the people who really have an effective relationship with the people, over and above any rhetoric about votes. There are no votes in Libya. There's consensus in the tribe or the clan. That's the reality. Secondly, I'm enormously concerned, and have been for months, and you know, about the situation in the south of Libya. That's a powder keg. It's exporting weapons in all directions. In some cases I saw it myself, without anyone paying the smallest attention to me. And I said that and nobody paid any attention. But what actual aid, I know there's no aid at the moment, but is there going to be planned immediately to seal Libya's southern borders with Chad and Niger? Libyans are doing what they can in a very complicated situation, but if there's no real aid to Niger, to Chad and to Sudan to seal this border, then we're going to get the biggest arms supermarket in the whole of the Sahel. Sofia Sakurafa.
Thank you. And thank you for the information you've given us. The Security Council of the UN has, after the visit of the President to Libya, expressed its support for Mr. Leon and has called upon the conflicting parties to negotiate. And here we've been talking about the destruction of the infrastructure in the country, and there was condemnation of what's been happening in terms of human rights, and then we've also heard about labour organisations and so on, and the financial system can't function. That has also been condemned. And then we have the resolution from 2014, which talks about measures to be taken against those who threaten stability and welfare. The question is whether you can tell us who the people are who are putting a spoke in the wheels of peace and prosperity or welfare and prosperity in Libya, because we've heard talk of you being in favour of the government in Tobruk. Can you tell us about your opinion on that, and can you go into that in a little bit greater detail?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Leon, for your statement. I admit it's a very difficult situation. In September, we passed a resolution, and many of the European demands are included in that, and we're supporting your mandate, and we're trying to ensure there's a national dialogue at a political level with all stakeholders. Do you have any contacts with the various militias and groups? We have an Amnesty International report from the end of October which says that particularly in the west of Libya there are many militias and armed groups which have been attacking civilians, and these atrocities, they could be tantamount to war crimes. So my question is whether you have any contact with those groups and what are you talking to them about. And secondly, we're asking you and the EU to ensure that there be a political dialogue taking place. What about the situation with the IDPs or those coming across the borders from the south? Migration. Have you talked to anyone about that?
Colega Castaldo.
Mr. Castaldo.
Muchas gracias, Presidente. Gentile rappresentante, la ringrazio.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, dear Representative, for your work and for your contribution to today's discussion. Of course, I very much concur with the idea that the Goremes II approach would be successful, although I see that a parliament, as Mr. Brok said, doesn't really represent a lot of its territory, so it's doubtful whether that would be a useful interlocutor. I wanted to ask you, because of the different historical roots between Chiritania and Tripolitania and the tribal nature of the south, how great a risk is there of a fragmentation over the next few months and years in this country? And I read a really interesting article, and I heard the statements of the Libyan ambassador to Italy, who said there's a need for NATO to come back to the country, but not as a peacekeeping force, but just actually to bomb them. Don't you think this is a complete admission of failure? If we want to try and look for an alternative in this country and to build democracy, aren't we being seen as distributors of cheap bombs, basically? Because their own ambassador is asking for this. Isn't it obvious that the absence of our strategy, there was no strategy in 2011, has been very adverse. Now, there are thousands and thousands of refugees and Libyans who have fled after 2011, and this is the only Arab Spring which is not really living up to the hopes that we had years ago. So, do you think Tunisia can play any role in this to achieve a truce and a political solution?
Do try to stick within your speaking time, otherwise Mr. Leon won't have time to reply.
Borghezio.
Mr. Borghezio.
Presidente, grazie.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Leon. I'd like to focus on one single issue, which is that of immigration, because everybody must see that from the Libyan point of view, it's very difficult even to see how these flows are going to evolve and who they're being controlled by. And I think you could perhaps fill us in on this aspect, which I would say is not a secondary issue, because somebody quite rightly said that this is a powder keg in Libya, and you said the same, which is of concern not only to the other countries on the northern shore of the Mediterranean, but also the neighboring countries. So who is controlling these flows? Is it the militia? And what is the role of the jihadists in these migratory flows? And what are the dangers to international security, given that, as far as it seems to me, nobody in the West seems to know anything about what's happening. And we have constant flows towards Europe, and particularly towards Italy, of people who are in transit through these mechanisms. So there's a great concern about such flows, which I think should be the focus of everybody's attention.
Thank you, Mr. Khan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Leon, for sharing your thoughts on the subject. And we clearly all understand the importance of stability of Libya, and we also understand that it is a tribal society. How do you see the interference and the using of this tribal society by the neighboring countries, and what steps are being taken to prevent this? And how much do you see that the Gaddafi loyalists regrouping and are also interfering, and what risks are there for that? And if you can also perhaps expand on these different groups, who is actually holding the land, what percentage, which group? And then finally, you talked about the jihadist camps. who exactly are these jihadists? Are they ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or something else? Thank you.
Señora Gómez.
Thank you.
Mrs. Gomes.
Back now with the UN Chapeau, Bernadino, and great tribute to your work, because it's really not just tough, but it's really dangerous. I know that you were subject to an attempt recently in Beda, and you survived it. And I want to say that I believe that indeed it's, as you put it very diplomatically, as a last opportunity for Libya. Antonio Panzeri highlighted that. In my opinion, we might be behind the last opportunity for Europe, because it's our guys who don't understand what is at stake, the dangers that indeed are there. And we could see them happening, didn't you? Didn't I? See it happening. We said it. If the fact that the problem was not that NATO did left too early, it was that the EU did not come in to actually tackle what was necessary to tackle, which was the central question of SSR-DDR, because it was obvious from the beginning that this militia, if left alone, would obviously transform into all sorts of interlinks with organized crime and terrorism, terrorists, as we have now, indeed. And my question is, and I salute your efforts to find a political solution, but that solution has to be backed by something very strong. And people are talking about the immediate neighbors, and we see indeed Tunisia already suffering a lot from more than 1.5 million in all the stress this is putting in their social services and so on. But what about the other not so close neighbors? One of them is very close, Egypt, that is clearly interfering, that is clearly backing one of the parties, the Tobruk government or whatever, Egypt and Saudi Arabia behind it. And what about Turkey and Qatar that are backing the Misuratans, who are indeed the ones in power in Tripoli?
Gracias, señora Gómez. El señor Corwin Naik.
Thank you, Mr. Corwin-Mikke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have only two short questions. First, isn't it possible that the best political solution is to divide Libya into Fezzan, Cyrenaica and Tripolis? And another question, is there a chance that some role could play the family of the late King Idris? Perhaps they have some influence over the quarreling gangs. Mr. Ner is perhaps you are right, of course. I'm only asking question. And if so, perhaps third question. Perhaps it is well to acknowledge that overthrowing of Mr. Gaddafi was a mistake.
Muchas gracias. Y ahora me toca a mí.
Thank you very much. Now it's my turn. I'm going to ask a question as a United Left GUI member, not as a chair. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but the things you have to remember, namely what a disaster this NATO intervention has been, hearing so many warlike cries again. What a pity it is that we didn't pay any attention to the Algerian African Union option, which would have been a different solution. So the innocent die, there's a humanitarian crisis, there's a civil war turning Libya into a failed state. And the worst thing is the destabilization of the region. According to French sources, French press sources, Libya is being used as a training base for Syrian, Tunisian and Egyptian jihadists with the support of Qatar. Egypt says it's not there, but the United States is accusing Egypt and the United Arab Emirates of secretly bombing the militias. And what really surprises and concerns me, an interview with the Tunisian interior minister in Algeria saying that Libya is going to be a delayed effect bomb for the neighbours. Particularly as regards Algeria, there are 4x4 vehicles, there are training camps, there are SAM-7 missiles which have vanished. There are RPG rockets of all kinds, and there are aircraft. 12 aircraft have disappeared from Libya, which could be used in spectacular operations in Tunisia and Algeria. These are in the hands of people who just think about sabotaging institutions. That's what that interview all said. Are we cooperating with the Arab League and countries in the region to achieve a national dialogue? And secondly, what about buying oil from the oil wells that are in the hands of the militias? You have the floor.
Bueno, un conjunto de...
Right, well, that was a nice, easy set of questions. As indeed everything to do with Libya is easy. I'll try and move quickly and answer the questions as far as possible. International consultation with the neighbouring countries and the Gulf countries is fundamental. Without such consultation, we won't be able to do any work. A number of questions touched on this. There are regional players whose influence is fundamental, and when I say the region, I'm not just talking about the neighbours. As Egypt, which is playing an important role, there are countries slightly further off, out of the immediate neighbourhood of Libya. Turkey, Qatar, the Emirates, all of those have great influence, and all of them are at the moment supporting the initiative. So this proposal is going to be put forward with the support of all the countries that we know have direct influence on the parties, and that we think is a very good thing. As to tomorrow's conference, it's set up by the P3+5 group. It used to be P3+3. The three permanent countries, that is United States, France, United Kingdom, plus now a group of a further 5 countries, or rather 4 countries, Italy, Spain, Germany and Malta, and the European Union. That's the group that's meeting tomorrow, which is a group that's following all the United Nations efforts very closely, and it's a very important support for us. Of course, there's no intention to exclude anybody. Quite the opposite. It's a very open group, and it's pushing forward various things. In Madrid, they set up P5+5+. In New York, there was something called the Kerry format, which included the regional countries and the Gulf countries. And now there's going to be a new meeting in that format set up, or people are talking about that and talking about holding it in Madrid. So what we're looking for is different formats expressing very clear support from the international community for these United Nations efforts with the various Libyan counterparts. It's too early to assess the results of 2174. It's too early because that resolution included the possibility of sanctions, targeted sanctions, targeted at people or groups who didn't cooperate with the political process or who undermined Libya's security. That process has already started. The Sanctions Committee in New York, with Rwanda in the chair, is consulting the Security Council to see who the people might be in military spheres who've kept brandishing threats or maintained armed activity in different areas of Libya, or the representatives of different political groups who are undermining or complicating or even at all costs preventing the achievement of a political solution. My mission, the mission that I lead, is of course involved when it's asked for information, but it's not directly cooperating or participating in the sanction fixing process. But I think that process is going forward very actively, and we can expect results soon, and that's when we'll be able to assess those results. As to the content of Gadames 2, Antonio Panseri was asking this. It's an initiative, first of all, involving, and this is also an answer to Mr. Nard, it doesn't just involve politicians. There's a political table which is central, and it will have not just politicians on it, but broader things, people linked to the legislative power, but it'll also include representatives of the municipal committees, which are the other democratically elected institutions in Libya, and there'll also be representatives of various other institutions and civil society, so as to make it a very inclusive meeting. But there are also going to be another 3 tables meeting in parallel. The first one will be for militias, the second one for tribal leaders, clan leaders, as Mr. Nard was calling them, and they're very important in Libya. And thirdly, for political parties. The clan and tribal leaders are more important in the countryside. They're particularly strong in the east and the south. In the more urban Libya and Tripolitania, the political parties are more important. So those 4 meetings, politicians, militia, tribals, and political parties, we hope to achieve a very inclusive process and a broad debate covering different areas within Libyan society and convincing them to take the last chance for them and for Europe, as Ana Gomes was rightly saying. The first stage of the negotiations is supposed to deal with what's called the roadmap, appointing a national unity government and getting the constitutional process back on track, because it's now been rather delayed, as you'll know. We think the constitution could be passed very soon and go to a referendum if there was stability in the country, which of course is not going to be easy, but we'll have to try. At a second stage, if we get through the first one successfully, we could then address the other pending institutional issues. So it will be a 2-stage process, an asymmetrical one, with a political table which is central, but other ones involving the armed participants, the clans and the political parties. And we hope that this process will start within a few days, and this is what we're calling Gadames 2. But I agree with you, there needs to be a plan B, or if it comes to that, a plan C. Gadames 2 is already the plan B to Gadames 1, so that means there needs to be a plan C somewhere, as the situation has got so much worse that at the moment it's really difficult to guess whether the political process will succeed or not. So then we'd have to go to other formats, including the armed participants, and then it would be more like a traditional peace conference. But I think there's still one chance for the politicians and for the political process. It's going to be very difficult. There were new bombings just today in the east of the country. In the last few weeks, in the last 10 days, aircraft have been used in a way, air forces have been used in a way that greatly worries the international community. There is still fighting going on in a very worrying way in Benghazi, so we have to see whether this is going to be possible. But that doesn't, of course, stop us thinking of fallback arrangements if the political process doesn't end up being able to solve all the problems.
I don't have any precise information on the trained people. I have read reports about it. I have heard from UK colleagues, especially problems that in the UK with some people involved in some sexual attacks. But I really don't have concrete information about people who have been trained in UK or in other countries and that may have turned up to be jihadists. So sorry, I cannot Same thing about Qatar training jihadists. I know there have been reports, but I don't have any precise information. What I can tell you at this point is that Qatar is very actively supporting the political process, a political solution. I think that all actors with some influence in Libya realize that the country is on the verge of total chaos, and they don't want they don't want this. Nobody want to see this total chaos in Libya, and this is what they are trying to do. After his action in the east, in Benghazi, and with these airstrikes recently, respond to the motto of fighting terrorism. However, there are some question marks. It is a militia. It is not part of the state armed forces, and we believe that the only effective way to fight terrorism is using the state institutions. This is one question mark. Second question mark, Mr. Haftar is not clear about what is his real intention. He, in February, proposed a kind of coup d'etat, and he has questioned on different occasions the democratic institutions, so it is not clear what is the goal. He's using air force and other military means which are not targeting specifically terrorists, as he says, but are also targeting civilians, neighborhoods, and this is not, as we know, a way to fight terrorism, nor to fight terrorists. Sometimes it could even become the opposite, to foster and to unite people against him, people who not necessarily should be united. Since Ansar al-Sharia has been declared a terrorist organization, we have seen a split in people fighting in Benghazi. So he was uniting these people against him, and it has been the international legality that has separated these people. So maybe international legality and international action is more effective than what he's doing. So there are a number of question marks, and I think what Mr. Haftar is doing is not very helpful. The best thing he could do is to give an opportunity to the political process and not to question the transition, the possible building of a democracy in Libya, although we know that it is going to take time, although we know the country will require a huge effort, internal and external, but he should give an opportunity. And finally, about the court decision, as I said before, it will be very difficult to take a position for a number of reasons, and one of these reasons is also the allegation that the court has taken this decision with intimidation, with the presence of militias in Tripoli. All this is true. At the same time, it has been true all over the last months. Libya has been a country with militias all the time, and this has been a challenge always. It's nothing new. The militias, the nature of the militias in Tripoli has changed, but before we had militias from Sintan and from other origins. So it's not easy. It's not easy. In any case, it is not the question. It is not the legal argument. The question is political. Even if there was a clear interpretation of this decision by the Supreme Court, you still will have a political problem in Libya. So what Libyans have to do is to find a political solution, and this is what the international community should encourage. Respecto a la pregunta del señor Nart.
As to Mr. Nard's question, I think I've answered the first one. Garamis too will include the tribe. This is tribal and clan leaders. As to his second question, of course, this is a very complicated question. Libya has 4,000 kilometers of land border, and we know that it's a very permeable border towards the Sahel. So all the Sahel issues are very much present there: terrorism, trafficking of human beings, of arms, of drugs, and so on. And it's extremely difficult because the states that you know very well south of Libya are extremely fragile ones with very little capacity to halt these forms of traffic. But we have to make an effort. The European Union has a border control mission, which I hope will soon be able to return to Libya and help there. But it's one of our main concerns at the moment. In the United Nations, our work has been closely involved with the European Union, and we all have to help because these countries don't have these capacities. Libya doesn't have it, won't have it for some time, and neither do its neighbours to the south have it.
Who oppose a political solution. Basically, you have extremists in both camps. You have people in the Islamist camp who are close to jihadism, who are close to radical Islamism, who are not supporting a political solution. This is very clear. We have seen some of these people in demonstrations recently in Tripoli against the United Nations, against dialogue. This is, fortunately, I think, is a minority. The mainstream, the moderate Islamists are now supporting a political solution. And the same thing at the other side. You have a group of moderates who I think represent the majority also supporting a political dialogue. But you have also a minority of extremists who think that all the Islamists are terrorists and that there's nothing to discuss with them. So you have this, and for the moment we don't see in these extremists, and especially when it comes to some of the armed groups, some of the most radical elements of Fajr Libya or the Haftar militia and others in the other camp, we don't see clear signs that they will support the political process. But we are talking to them, and also I take the opportunity to answer the question about the militias, whom we are, of course, talking to these militias. It will be useless to promote a political agreement if we didn't have the armed groups somehow on board. They will not take decisions, they cannot impose decisions, you cannot get political gains out of armed actions, but at the same time you cannot have a solution for the Libyan crisis if you don't bring on board somehow the armed groups. So we are talking to them, as I said, they will be a part of the process we are starting now. For Mr. Castoldo, risk of division and fragmentation, Libya is already divided. Libya is already divided. This is the reality. You have two parliaments, two governments, majority of the military control in the east is Haftar, in the west is Fajr Libya. This is why it's so important to seize the opportunity for the Libyans and for the international community. So I think Ana Gomez is very right when she says it's the last opportunity for them and for us, because the situation is what it is. Also, the south has its own dynamics, as Mr. Nat said before. So the risk is already there. What we must try to do is to overcome this division, to reunite the country, because we don't think Libya is viable if it is not united. That's what we think. I agree with you. We are paying the price of a certain absence of the international community since 2011. And, of course, Tunisia can play a role, especially it's very influential in the West and in Tripoli. No sé quién controla los flujos migratorios.
I don't know who's moving the migratory flows, but I think they're probably mafias. They're not political groups, they're not militias. You can't accuse them of controlling these flows. But it's a difficult situation to assess at the moment, because with the insecurity and confrontation in Libya, there are no institutions, there's no police, there's no administration. And all of this has to be resolved and produced before you can answer the question, who are the mafias and are they responsible for this trafficking of human beings that has brought more than 100,000 people to Europe in the course of the year. The jihadists have an important role. This is also answering the question of who are the jihadists. Most of the ones in Libya are in Tarna and in Benghazi, and they haven't expressed any political affiliation with ISIS. They're more traditional sort of jihadists, some of them linked to Al-Qaeda. But there's one group, the Young Shura of Darna, which has expressed some link with ISIS. Seems to be a small phenomenon, but we're still worried about it. Then there are other groups which haven't expressed support publicly, but might soon. Ansar Sharia in Benghazi and Darna both have been declared terrorist groups. But there's also Yaish al-Islam, the Martyrs of Abu Salim. There are other groups which are particularly active in Darna, which can be included in this same group. I don't think there's much presence of Gaddafi regime people. There are sectors in Tripoli and certain Islamist sectors who use this as part of their narrative, this idea that the Gaddafists are coming back. But there's no group that is made up of a majority of former regime supporters. And in our political dialogue, we have the people, therefore, who ought to participate in the building of a future democratic Libya. What is true is that there are some former Gaddafi regime members who are trying to interfere, who are trying to spoil, who are trying to use the conflict to say that the Gaddafi regime should have been allowed to continue. Anna, I entirely agree with you. Without this international support, there will be no agreement. So I stress the key countries are supporting us. The European Union is fundamental. We have to avoid repeating the errors of the past, which indeed you very often called attention to. There is no solution in a division of Libya, I think that's clear. King Idris and his family could play a role because of their importance in certain eastern tribes, which will have to be part of a future solution. But I don't see any possible return, in the short term at least, of the monarchy to Libya. And I don't think it was a mistake. I don't think there was any alternative. I don't think that the Gaddafi regime could have been maintained. I don't think myself there was any alternative to what was done. Either you let Gaddafi's troops, who were at the gates of Benghazi, commit an appalling massacre in that city, or else you stopped that attack, you held that attack back and reversed the flow and allowed the revolutionary forces to win through as they did. I don't think there would have been time, if you ask me, for a diplomatic initiative. It would have been very nice if it had been possible, but I don't think that diplomatic initiative would have come in time, because Gaddafi's forces were already before the gates, in fact the special forces already inside the gates of the city. But of course we'll never know. There is cooperation with the African Union. This evening I'm going to Addis Ababa for a meeting tomorrow of the contact group that the African Union has set up on Libya with the countries of the region as well. Tomorrow in Sudan, the neighbouring countries are meeting in order to cooperate with the United Nations initiatives and talk about their own initiatives. And lastly, buying oil from not just oil and gas assets, but financial assets. Well, that'll be spoken about at the ministerial meeting here. I think the international community is very worried about the possible use of these economic assets by certain groups. As I said at the beginning, there are major economic consequences there for all international players, and we have to make sure that this is prevented, and that, I think, is part of Europe's job and part of this Parliament's job. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Leon, for all possible luck and success we wish you, because the success, of course, depends on, will produce an improvement for Libyans, for the region, and indeed for all of us, and you can always count on our support.
Meine Kolleginnen und Kollegen, wir kommen jetzt.
Colleagues, that brings us on to an issue which we can think about for about an hour. And anyway, I think this is a technical report. Would anyone like to take the floor on it? Apparently not. So I think we should proceed to the vote. The vote is open.
Die Abstimmung ist
The vote is closed. Not yet?
geschlossen.
It's closed now.
Ich möchte den
I would like to thank the rapporteur for his excellent work.
und
And I will now close the meeting.
Was? Das war doch mit Durchschlagskraft vorgetragen. Ne?